Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the BuzzStream Podcast. My name's Vince Nero. I'm your host, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Mike Fahey. Mike has been in business for over 15 years. He's currently the founder of Fahey Communications, but before starting his own agency, Mike worked all over the place in newsrooms in Boston, Baltimore, won 4 Emmys along the way. He was even a press secretary for a presidential candidate. I won't tell you which one. You have to listen to find out. But Mike's had this great insider look at how these newsrooms work, especially in the US. And I wanted to really pick his brain today about how they work, difference between kind of TV coverage and newspaper, digital coverage, all that good stuff. So before we get into it, I just want to remind people, like, subscribe, share the stuff with your colleagues, comment on the posts. The more that you do, the more I can have great guests on like Mike. And secondly, just a reminder to check out List IQ if you're in the market for trying to build media lists, but it's taking you a real long time and you do it manually using Google News. List IQ is our great new tool to help you streamline a lot of that information gathering, and it pulls all the information for you right from the SERP and saves a ton of time. So that's it. Now on with the show. Mike, how you doing? Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, you are coming off a Fox News interview this morning. You were putting out client fires right before this. You're a busy guy. Tell us about what were you on Fox News for?
Yeah, so this morning, 5:30. It's funny. And I guess that there's kind of if we're going to look into the bigger conversation that we're going to have, I was on Fox News at 5:30 this morning, talking about President Trump over in China. I was on Fox News a week ago at 11:30 p.m. talking about Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. So I think that one of the wild messages that I always say that I've always held fast to in my career in PR, news happens at all times. You just have to know who you're pitching at the right time to get the results. I think that a lot of people that think the roundabout thing that I'm getting to here is oh, no one's on news at night. Well, people are on the news at 5:30 in the morning. And I'm gonna toot my own horn. I did a good enough job this morning that I got asked back again tomorrow morning. So I'm fine. If I'm going to be your late at night, early morning expert, sign me up. I'm both a night owl and a morning person when need to be. I'm right. Nimble and I will, I can make it work.
Well, so as I alluded to,
I'm getting a phone call right now from a news outlet in Pennsylvania. So you never know when they're going to call. You never know what they're going to want.
Man,
I would actually love to know what they want, but you want to know what? We're on a podcast right now. They can wait because I haven't pitched them today. So I'm not sure what they're going to want, but it just goes to show you 1 o'clock on a Thursday, you never know who's going to call.
Well, I appreciate you making time for this. I would love to, as I alluded to in the intro, there is, I think, a big difference between pitching for TV, pitching for inclusion in a digital article, and you were news director, producer, held these roles that I think would help give our users and listeners a great understanding of how all this stuff works. So can you help me? Let's start at the beginning let's break down the structure of the newsroom. We'll start there. That's probably the most pertinent.
So let's just take any newsroom, and I think that this is always interesting because when people, the amount of time and effort I spend on media lists is wild. Because people just think that you can type in reporter, editor, and then just hit, a spray and pray method and see who's going to respond. That's not necessarily going to get you the results that you want, but that's because every newsroom has different titles. Every newsroom has different, hierarchy, different structures. A newspaper newsroom is going to look a lot different than a TV newsroom. So basically, on the surface level anywhere, in a new TV newsroom, you're going to have your assignment desk. I look at them as the gatekeepers. They're the ones that are the hub of knowledge. They're listening to scanners, monitoring the internet, monitoring emails. They're the ones who's answering the cell phones. They're answering and the regular phones too. But also, then, they're also setting the agenda for the day. In any news organization, you kind of have the centralized planner. That's kind of the centralized hub where anyone can look at any time and see what's going on in real time, up to the date, whether that's breaking news, press releases, content. It keeps the schedule of events, so to speak. So I think that as you're trying to get into those places, your assignment editor is the person who's going to give your story to the masses if you can't reach them otherwise. From there, most news organizations have several planning meetings throughout the day. If you're a general assignment reporter, you're going to start your day at 9:30, pitching what story you want to cover for the day. So I've always said that not enough work goes into reaching those reporters before they're pitching the story. If you're sending out a newsroom pitch at 11:30 every morning, I'm going to be honest, you're not going to have the same conversion rate, because that means that the person you were then asking, think of it this way, you're going about your day, whatever your job may be. And then at 11:30, you're 3 hours into your day, someone comes to you and they're like, we need you to completely switch directions. How often are you going to be able to do that? So if you're not setting the table for these reporters first thing in the morning, or understanding the difference between a morning reporter, a dayside reporter, and a nightside reporter, and that's another term that carries through no matter what the news organizations. A morning reporter is getting to 3:00 in the morning. I'm going to give you guys a little secret. Not a lot of morning reporters are doing a lot of enterprise reporting. The bulk of your enterprise reporting is going to come from reporters that get to work every day between 9 and 10. Those are your reporters that have the time. That's when officials are ready to speak. That's when news conferences happen. So those are the reporters that have more bandwidth to do those types of stories. A nightside reporter who gets between 2 and 3, they're covering the news of the day. They're covering breaking news. They're not the greatest to do that. But also, if you're going to look at news reporting, you may be able to get, I always say they call it one-stop shopping. A lot of those reporters, I often if I have a really good story that's self-contained that I know is a feel-good story, is more of a feature, I'll try to pitch someone that comes in at 3:00 to get it into the 6:00 news, hoping for the best. But I think that the other message that I'm even hearing myself say as I talk to you about this, that there has to be strategy that goes into your pitching, or else you're going to come up short time and time again.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you talking about some of these roles that I know in a lot of newsrooms, it's tough to know kind of where these lines are. I mean, for a lot of people, it doesn't say necessarily that they are a daytime reporter as their role. It just might say they're a reporter or whatever. I mean, is it worth just kind of telling people to look at the way they publish, like the times that they publish, and that is more indicative of what they cover?
This is what I used to do when I first started. And listen, it's something that I probably would still do today if I was still as much in the trenches as I was. Back then, I would wake up in the morning, especially if I had like a good dayside story. And I would watch all of the local news stations in a market, see who was reporting, see what story they were reporting on, and then be like, hey, I know they're on a fire. If you have any bandwidth, here's a really good story that's a feature this week. So that they knew that I was covering it. And listen, that takes a lot of time and it's a lot of effort. And I think that the other big thing in PR that we don't really talk a lot about is the triaging of things. But there's going to be a moment when you have a client that needs that hit for whatever that reason may be. It may be to keep your contract extended. It may be because the story is important. We all have different reasons for doing the things that we do. But I think that in those situations, it's important to try to, figure out creative ways to get on those radars. But you're right. If you wake up in the morning, you'll see who the nightside reporters are. But also when you're looking to build media lists, I'll type in nightside. I type in morning, because it may not pop up in someone's title. It may pop up in their bio, but also I think that obviously the game has changed with remote work. People are able to now do PR in markets they probably hadn't been able to do that before. But I think that if you're going to integrate yourself into a market, it has to be like a reporter. PR agencies have to be nimble like the reporters have been in the past. You have to understand what the fabric and what the DNA of that media market looks like if you're going to be able to pitch it well.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny. I have, my brother, these are extreme examples, but my brother runs a podcast, for instance, and it's a movie podcast, and he just gets pitched everything under the sun that has to do with technology, movies, and this idea of matching based off of a bio, I feel like is still even, you might take a keyword or something and be find me everyone that works about tech or movies. I talk a lot about this on the podcast about how that's not enough, right? Finding the actual industry that someone's into, it takes a lot more than just reading a bio. So I'd love to kind of understand from you, when you're pitching and making a media list, what else do you look at besides those things, besides the bio, besides the title? I mean, you mentioned watching them on TV. Are there other things that you can use to glean some of those insights?
I mean, I'm a psychopath. and I look very deeply into all of these things. Like for me, like if you could see like the way my media lists shape up, like it's insane. Like I will like look like past coverage, like the number of things, the number of things that I throw into the kitchen sink when I'm trying to make a media list are wild. But here's the thing, and this is the other thing people don't talk about a lot. If I spend like 5 hours making this media list that is my best of, I'm going to be able to use it over and over again. Like putting that work forward to start, doing a little research, figuring it out. Like I will joke and say that like when I started my career in PR, I thought I was going to be the greatest person in the history of time. I knew these newsrooms like the back of my hand. I knew how to find them. And then I didn't know anything about any of these tools. I didn't know how pitching worked. So I would do those exact steps. Those steps that I talk about that I still use today on occasion, those were my bread and butter back then. I would be like, okay, who's reporting on the news? Who's the morning anchor? Nowadays it's a little bit easier. Now we have a lot of tools that aid in that. But at the same time, like I'll do like creative searches for like people that have covered certain things in the past. I'm a big use of like, and this is going to date me, but I'm a big use of like the quotation marks in searching.
Oh yeah.
But like,
sure.
but like
Yeah.
7 different delineations. I'm sure there's probably way better ways to do it. Like, but
You'd be surprised.
give me that exact match, and then I'll discern. And I think that the thing that comes into that too is that like the way my brain works, there's a lot of steps that go into it, and then I always simplify it. I forget to tell you that like then I go back through and I like plug out the people that I know that it wouldn't cover it. You know what I mean? Like there's discernment that goes into it across everything. But I think that the initial step is finding anyone that may cover it. I have like a really important producers media list that I fall back on a lot, especially like booking producers for cable news. But I think that the other message that is so important today is that like it's a race. Like you can call it what you want. These reporters are more taxed than ever. These producers are more taxed than ever. Like you have to hand it to them on a silver platter the minute that they're looking for it. And I think my other message that I always say to people a lot too is like, don't forget, like just because no one answered doesn't mean they weren't interested. I get like 3rd day, 3rd week, 3rd month hits when I least expect it, because I wrote a good pitch that was easily searched. Don't forget that we shouldn't just be indexing for AI. We should also be indexing for inboxes so that people can find your clients, after the fact. Not too long ago, I got an email and it was a year and a half later about a very specific story that I had pitched. It was a report from the LA Times of all places. And he was like, whatever happened with this? And I was like, sir, like, it's been like a year and a half. Like, this wasn't that great of a story to begin with. All of the things to want an update on, I wasn't expecting it to be this.
But I do love that idea of like optimizing for an inbox. I mean, you're definitely not the first person to say, like a lot of journalists have told me they use inboxes in the same way that you would almost like a search, like searching Google where, they're looking for an expert on something and they just go back into their inbox and search for it that way. Can you help me understand, like when we're talking about getting featured on like cable news, getting featured on like kind of like the digital video, how does pitching for that differ from pitching for people who are going to just write an article online, a journalist who's going to write an article, if at all?
I think that it's similar. I think that like the proof of performance is the part that like you need to show a little bit. That literally not even talking, as we're talking this through, like I'm like, you know what, I've gotten away from that in the past. Like that was something that I used to really care about that I probably should care about more. Like especially if you're gonna put someone on TV, if you're gonna put someone online, and they're gonna be speaking, like if it's a good reporter, they're going to watch clips of them. So if you're a good PR, agent, if you're a good publicist, you are going to make sure you have good clips of your clients available to see. And it's funny because like I don't know if it just hasn't happened again, but like really early on in my career, I had a few big things that went up in front of like GMA and the Today Show. And the thing that I always came back with was like, do you have some clips of this client? It's almost like you have to have a sizzle reel of the best sound bites that they've ever put out.
Right.
If you do, you're in luck. Things like that, can happen. Things like that, are possible.
Is that a disqualifier if they don't? Like if you have someone that's new to the game, you're trying to get them TV coverage?
No, I think that like everyone has to start somewhere. Do I think that it can be a bigger hill to have to climb? Absolutely. Do I think that you can pitch GMA today when you've never been on television before? Probably not. But that is not to say you can't try. That's not to say you can't do some media training. I just think that you have a higher threshold to carry over. But again, that's what I would say to anyone that's trying to break through to tier one. The tier one wins that I get every week are a miracle. Like, why? I could tell you that I have the greatest pitching method in America. I could tell you that my knowledge of newsrooms is second to none. And yeah, maybe that's true. Who knows? But at the end of the day, this comes down to shooting your shot, dumb luck, the right place at the right time, the right pitch at the right time in front of the right reporter. The biggest hit of my career that I've ever gotten, well, one of them, I landed a segment in Good Morning America. I didn't even know that it aired until after it aired. I got an email from their medical EP the next morning being like, your client was on GMA yesterday, wanted to let you know. I was like, wow, would have been great if I'd known that when they were on GMA. Cool. Thank you so much. But why didn't you tell me in the first place? The wildest part too is GMA, biggest news outlets in the world. He was like, they didn't use the client name in the coverage. So he gave me the make good and he put it in the web story. Nice. That lives on my social media forever. When you think of it that way, I don't want to say blindly pitched because there was I would probably say blindly pitched to a friend, but in reality, it wasn't a blind pitch. I think that anyone that says that knows what they're doing in this industry knows that's not the case. I can say it's blind, but in reality, there's probably been 75 steps that have gone into putting out that pitch in the first place. It just sometimes feels blind because you're not sure if anyone's getting it. That's not to say that if you're not taking 70 of those 75 steps, you're probably doing some things wrong. And again, I'm not saying my way's right, but I'm just saying sometimes I think that having done this for as long as I have, I forget the minutia that goes into it because it's just ingrained in my DNA.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can tease out some of these because I think the thing that a lot of people in digital PR space probably run into is that idea of matching right time with the right person. And so we do rely, I think, a lot on media databases and maybe some of your own manual research, matching, say, an article, they've covered this article, so they're more likely to cover a similar article. Or, a lot of what we do, I'd say, is pitching things like a survey. Survey found that, X number of Americans, I saw one today, it was about Dave & Buster's did this article. It was people aren't having fun anymore. And that was the big hook is 50% of Americans are saying that they don't have any fun. So, something like that, where you're trying to find a reporter basically who's going to be interested in this third party data study or something. What are steps? What are some steps? Are you looking at, okay, I'm going to find the right, look at their job titles? Are you going to the specific outlets that you want first and going that way? Are you trying to find people who have covered similar articles? Help us kind of get into some of those 75 steps that you talked about that you've been doing for years.
And I can tell you, I'll use a great example. I, did some work earlier this year with a client that did a lot of survey pitching. The seniors in this state are having a hard time retiring.
Yep.
Which is great. But how do you then get hits? And, this was a client that I was doing some freelance work for. So it wasn't necessarily someone who I was able to advise. I was kind of being I was the executioner. They gave me the pitch. They said, get us hits. So that actually kind of gave me a unique place, where I sat to be you're not doing this right. You're not doing, and they weren't giving me the media list, so I'm sure they were saving a lot of money on cheap labor that way, but for me, it was okay, here's this pitch. How do you execute now? And my thing was, I was okay, if my state's 25 out of 50, probably not going to cover it. So for me, the first thing I was okay, I'm going to take the best and the worst, top 5, bottom 5. I think something that you hit on earlier too, when do you send those pitches? Anyone that's blocked sending pitches, that's not taking time zone into effect, is doing it wrong. Why are you going to send someone on the West Coast a pitch that gets in their inbox at 5 o'clock in the morning? Now, that's not to say on the East Coast, there may be a day where I'm sending a pitch at that early, but that's because I'm doing it for a reason. The simple just because explanation for anything in PR doesn't hold water with me because we should be making deliberate decisions on the way that we pitch because we want deliberate decisions in the way that our clients are covered at the end of the day. So if we look at that discernment, it's okay, who are your top news outlets? But I could send a pitch to every single member of a news organization, or I could find the writers, the digital content producers. Is this a type of story that's going to get coverage on air? Is this kind of story that's going to get coverage online? I am never above building a personal relationship with web producers who I can then go back to the well from and say, hey, I have another story. Can you put this online? It's a good story that'll do well online. Because I think that one of the things that we struggle with in PR, a good clickbait story, how do you get it published? How do you find those people that still write? They used to call them listicles. Then they called them, I always say now it's like the top ideas that Gen X has about money. Now it's like generational type stories has replaced the listicles. 5 things to do this summer, 5 things to buy this May. But I've seen all those trends, and I've been in newsrooms for so long that I remember when I used to have to write a nightly tease about the 7 things that you want to buy on President's Day weekend. And now it looks different. Now it's clickbait. I remember a million years ago when the biggest thing people wanted to do was slideshows. And it was the 75 chains that changed up their menu this month. So you would just keep clicking to generate organic views to a website.
Right.
And I think that's a part of it too. We all have to understand the industry that goes into this, the KPIs that drive some of the things that we do. I once spent, this is not an exaggeration, months of my life developing an Instagram video strategy for viral videos for a news station. And it took me out of the mix. And it was how do we get this edited? How do we get this to ABC News? And, this was right as stories were starting to get big. This was probably, almost 10 years ago. And, we wanted to mirror ourselves after the Daily Mail. But, guess what? They had a massive digital news operation. We were a TV station trying to get stuff on an iPad. And I once spent days of my life trying to figure out, how do I edit something in Premiere and then get it to upload to my phone to upload it to Instagram? And today you can edit just the same on your Instagram app as you can. The phone in your hand processes video like a real computer. But God, it has been a long path to get here without a doubt.
That's maybe a good transition into this idea of the newsrooms that are changing these days. And one of the big trends, at least in the UK, has been layoffs. Are you seeing the same type of things here in the US where it's a shrinking journalist pool?
God, yeah. Not only is it shrinking, but these reporters are greener and more taxed than they ever have been before. We're seeing layoffs, we're seeing buyouts. It's definitely something that is a real concern and a real consideration. Reporters that used to turn 1 story a day, are now turning 2 or 3. Digital reporters, digital content creators within these news outlets. I would not be surprised if a digital producer for a main news organization is putting out somewhere between 20 and 30 articles a day. So that's when you realize, if you're sending out a pitch that is slightly nuanced, that needs some additional corroboration, it's going to be hard to get it over the finish line. And that is just the facts. These reporters, these producers, and also I think the other thing too is remember, I'm going to age myself. I'm 40. When I was in college, everyone was the digital revolution is coming. There's not going to be a thing as broadcast news. Everything's going to go online. 20 years later, that has not necessarily happened completely. It is definitely a version of that truth that exists today. But I think the one thing that is of note is that the web teams are probably the greenest teams, in my opinion, in my experience, in some of these stations. These web producers are straight out of college, because it's, not to pull back the curtain, but they're cheap labor. You can hire 6 of them to put out 20 stories a day for the price of 1 seasoned person. So then you hire 1 boss who oversees everything. The lack of oversight. I'll just be candid and tell you that sometimes it's terrifying. These people have access to main newsroom websites. They're publishing stories that don't necessarily get fact checked. Some of the factors that I have seen in my time in PR, I once did with a major news outlet, a feature piece on a business. And that business's name was spelt wrong in every single reference in the story 37 times. This is a tier one outlet with and I won't say who, but also a newspaper. So there are definitely copy editors. Like people don't realize copy editing doesn't really exist on the broadcast news side of things. You're lucky if you have like a digital EP looking at stuff. I guess they're probably relying heavily on AI and spell check to try to save the day now, Grammarly to,
Right.
rescue those dangling participles and commas. But at the same time, that can be very problematic if and this wasn't a green reporter. This was a very seasoned reporter. So it just goes to show you that the margin for error now is bigger than it probably ever has been before.
Can I ask, do you have a sense for, we're talking about these journalists, these greener journalists, and they have a lot more on their plate, tasked with a lot more writing. How much of their work is like their stories that they're coming up with are from pitches versus stuff they're coming up with themselves or coming from the assignment editor, like the newsroom specific stuff where it's like every year we cover this anyway.
I mean, I think that's a huge thing. We've covered this before. Let's copy and paste the story from last year and change the date. I think that absolutely exists, but I also think that it's literally I've done, I can candidly say, having now spent, 6 years solely on the PR side of things, that I do things differently, and I've used unique ways to break through. To my knowledge, and I'm sure there's someone else who's going to watch this and be like, oh, I do that too. I was one of the first people that I know of that started to put animated GIFs in the top of emails when it was viral video. How are you going to pitch someone a great video story if they can't see the video? At the end of the day, these producers, these writers are still digital media consumers. So I always had a lot of obviously then you worry, will this load? Will my email be sent? I always took the next step and purchase software that allowed me to do that. I wasn't just yamming, 7,000 newsrooms. I was actually building HTML coded pitches that would go out to people. And guess what? I've seen really strong results. I had a template and I used, one of those software generators, and I had a really cool template, and I would just swap out the picture and make the headline. I would add breaking news banners. My emails were aesthetically pleasing and I don't want to say a work of art, but because I'm not that good of a graphic designer, I'd probably with AI, I'd be the best, but what I was able to do was send something that was more than just your standard pitch that reads, hi, Vince, good morning, exclamation point. And don't get me wrong. That is not to say that I do not send those emails every day, because that is the nature of the beast, is sending those types of emails to get pitches out the door. But what I found is that the level of customization, but you want to know what, actually, and I would like to take out my soapbox now and talk about something else that I have seen recently, is the use of AI agents and how that is also kind of impacting the way that pitching is going. Some of these, I don't want to say bad actors, but they're bad actors, are taking people's money, saying that they're pitching them. And then they're pitching them for these ops that don't even relate, but the pitches are being written with a level of AI specification that the reporters are really enthused. Oh, we'd love to talk to you. But my client is a politician and you want him to talk about dairy prices in the Midwest. It's just, and that scares me because these are services that cost a lot of money that you could unknowingly be sullying the reputation of your clients by hiring some of these firms, because you don't realize that the pitches that they're sending out aren't even kind of tangentially related to the people that you're representing.
Yeah, I mean, that has been an extreme problem, I think. And I bring it around to kind of the green nature of some of the journalists, and that the point you made about fact checking and them not having the time to do that and that sort of thing. I know we're seeing more and more of these stories coming out of fake people who are, fake experts being quoted in these, massive top tier news outlets, and people are digging into it and be like, this person doesn't even exist, but you're using them as an expert in your article. I want to get back to the pitching thing too, though. I want to make sure I'm clear. So do you have a sense for if journalists these days, what is that ratio of them coming up with their own pitches versus using pitches from, say, you or I?
So from my experience in newsrooms, they can go in with their ideas. And if they're good enough, they're going to do that. You know what I mean? Like if they can get it over the finish line, they get to do it.
Got it.
And that means that
So
those
really
pitches
just
need
has
to
to
be
be a
like
good
bulletproof
idea.
and ironclad. But I think that there's not a newsroom in America where the journalists are not continuing to pitch their own stories every day. But that being said, the breaking news cycle trumps that, you know, especially in markets that are, if it bleeds, it leads, breaking news oriented. Like I'll use Boston as an example. I worked there for almost a decade. There's not a ton of enterprise reporting that goes on in broadcast stations in Boston because the climate of the news here is very driven by what is going on as breaking news. Oh, there's a car crash. Oh, there's a house fire. Like, and I think that's something that like we've seen now, like with research and with ratings and with, you know, just like the caliber and quality of newscasts that are being putting out. Like, I don't know if viewers want that anymore. You know, I think that we saw kind of a content reckoning during COVID where people wanted real stories. You know, like just because there's flashing lights or smoke in the sky doesn't necessarily warrant a news story. But I think that you'd be hard for like if I were to go onto any website right now for a Boston television station, I promise you right now, all of the websites look the same and they're all covering breaking news, court cases, fires, shootings.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those reporters that you're pitching in a top, especially in a top 10 market that doesn't value enterprise reporting, you have an uphill battle ahead of you.
Right. Well, it's a good maybe segue into another question I wanted to ask, and it's this idea of like, is it possible to make any company or brand newsworthy?
I think so, if you do it the right way. I
So
think that like,
so say you're in the Boston area, right? They're worried about local news, car crashes, crime, that sort of thing. But you're opening a brand new store or something. How do you make that timely? How do you make that fit in a breaking news cycle that is dominated by other more, you know, sexy things?
I can give
alluring
you
things.
an example from the last week of my life. Now, I don't do a ton of hospitality, but I was recently involved in the opening of a new restaurant. And listen, Boston News doesn't cover restaurant openings. They just don't. Like it's just that Boston. Like, you know, there's a new restaurant opening every day. I just talked about that news cycle here. We had this awesome, and this is a client that I've worked with for 5 years, who's like family. Like if there's anyone that I'd want to get a win for, it would be him. And he had named the restaurant after his great grandmother, and again he did this on his own, but he was rolling on video when his mom found out that they had named it after a family member. She starts to cry and it's super emotional. And he sends it to me and he's like, look at this great video. My mom was so excited. Listen, you have to always be thinking like a producer. I was like, this isn't just great video. Like this is like the jackpot. So what did I do? I released it on Mother's Day and it was on every station in Boston. So that is how a restaurant opening made front page news on a weekend in the slow news cycle on Mother's Day. I have done wild, if we need to talk about politics, politics can be tough too. I've launched major political campaigns to tie in with unique anniversaries in order to generate news coverage. And I won't say which one because it's not necessarily the one that I'm most proud of. But if you Google the most highly covered congressional candidate announcement in West Virginia state history, you'll see who my client was because we announced his candidacy on a very, I'm just going to do it. I'll pull it back because it does, like, this was a long time ago. He was a January 6er. I don't talk about working with him a lot because things have, changed a lot politically with him and I. So I won't mention him by name. I'm sure he's never going to see this, so I can tell the story a little bit more. But I launched a Senate campaign for a January 6er. And I launched it on January 6th. And it was the most highly covered congressional announcement in the state of West Virginia's media history. We did like exclusives and it was crazy. But here's the thing. When are you going to get the most coverage out of that? On that anniversary. So I think that like you strategically have to think about, do I have a Mother's Day angle? What is the news angle here? In PR, we call it newsjacking, but that has to become a part of your DNA when you're working with clients.
Do you think that timely hook thing is the key to most pitches? Like it needs to have something that makes the journalist or the producer make sense to pitch.
Make it make sense, but also like give them that sense of urgency and like also give them that sense of like, if you don't do this story, someone else is going to. Comparison is the highest form of flattery. It's also the thief of joy. So basically, make sure if they think I'm going to, and like I'll pull back the curtain on this one. I'll do shady stuff with that too. Well, I'd be like when I send a follow-up, I'll be like, hey, several stations have called looking to set up an interview with so-and-so today. If you want to join in, just let me know. Guess what? No
Yeah.
stations have called, but now if they think that their competition is going to, they may actually show up.
Yeah.
Gamesmanship, I guess you should call that.
Hey, it's strategy. I like it. Do you feel like getting kind of, or let's put it this way, what do you think is easier to get covered these days? Kind of showcasing a particular client and like getting them an interview somewhere, getting them a quote in an article, or having some data-driven study, survey, that sort of thing?
So it's funny. I think that like getting your client integrated through a quote is easier than the data. I think that like in 2026, with the revolution of AI, anyone can put out data at any time. Like every 30 seconds, a new study is dropped. That probably tells you the opposite of what the study told you last week. And I think that like study PR is like damaging the credibility of all studies across the country. And I was a sociology major, so I did my fair share of studies in college. But I can tell you that like, that's not moving the needle the way people think that it is. Now, that's not to say that it's not an important tool in your tool belt. You never know when you're going to need it. I've absolutely suggested that to clients that I haven't like been able to break through on. I think that like, especially like in that AI space, I think that's the thing. What I think that I would say at the end of the day is it comes down to point of difference. Is this a study that's never been done before? Do you have some shocking data? Is the data alone going to make me say, wow, I need to cover this? Then yeah, lead to the data. But I think that's the other thing that we all have to do in PR. You have to be honest and transparent with your clients. Do you have the stuff that it takes to get coverage? And like, if you're good at this job, you'll always advise people accurately. Now, I've had very few clients go south. I had one recently and I guess the other thing, the converse of that is they also have to be able to have the proof of performance once you get them the coverage. I worked with a company back in November when the SNAP crisis was starting and people were losing their food stamps. And this person was like, I have a virtual food pantry and, this, that, and the third. And I was like, oh, wow, like this is a really cool, timely. I got them set up with GMA, like every station in Boston, a couple of national things. And they kept coming back to me that like the interviews weren't airing. And like, it was a weird breaking story. I really couldn't figure it out. But eventually I kicked the tires a little bit and found out that like, it was kind of just like a pipe dream. There was no food being delivered. I should have done more due diligence on the front end. But this person like had pictures, you know what I mean? But like somewhere in the vetting process of a story, the reporter started to suss out that like there was more going on here that was below board than above board. And that client didn't get the coverage they wanted, but like I always say that like I can't guarantee you anything, but the only thing that I can guarantee is that you need to be able to work with me and that you need to be able to stand behind the things that I get done for you.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that kind of stuff happens a lot, even in like there's a lot of crossover in the digital PR space with like SEO and like just like digital marketing in general. And I feel like that type of thing where it's like the product doesn't hold up to this maybe the story and the standards that they're putting forward in these pitches and whatnot. So yeah, I've definitely seen that come back and bite a client in the butt sometimes. Mike, before we close here, and I want to make sure I'm not stepping on anything that you don't want to talk about. So you mentioned the Senate.
Yes.
The senator,
let's go there.
Is that the same person that you were press secretary for as
no
presidential campaign? Okay.
No.
So let's get into that. I want to know what it was like being press secretary for Steve Laffey.
So Steve Laffey is one of like, I'll say, I can't say enough amazing things about that man. He's like a dad to me. We're like family at this point. We send each other Christmas cards when he's in town. I see him. Now, anything good that I say about a politician always comes back to Steve Laffey. And like that's another wild story. So like, but the January 6th comes right before that. So I had run this campaign out of West Virginia. It had been like really successful. And I saw this posting and, on a job board, and it was like looking for someone to launch a presidential campaign. And I happened to have the chutzpah to be like, I can do that. I just did that. I just did a really big one. Like, let's go. And I started working with Steve, and, like, I don't think I even realized in the moment what was going on. Like, I think sometimes our biggest clients move the fastest and we don't even realize that it's happening in real time. And then you're like, wait a minute, like, did this happen? Really? No, but it was awesome. And to be on the campaign trail in that election cycle, I got to meet every candidate. I'm working on something. I'm in the early stages of working on something about that, because I think that, like, to have run two wildly different campaigns in a wildly controversial election cycle.
Cool stories.
A moderate journalist from the Northeast, who I think a lot of people would assume, like, I'm a registered independent. I have no problem saying I was a journalist for 15 years. I try to be as moderate as the day's long. I search for facts, not for party affiliation. I get to have a little more loosey-goosiness to that right now. I'm currently running a political campaign in real time. I love to dip my toe back into that political arena because it's fun.
Yeah, it's exciting.
But at the same time, like, it's also nice to, like, be able to be a spectator at the same time. But anyways, people always say, oh, you're from Boston, so you're definitely very, very liberal. And, like, I'm very, very moderate. Like, I'm a newsman. I follow the news. I follow those stories. I don't see party. I don't see party. I see politicians.
Yeah. And I'm sure you see news opportunities everywhere. I mean, tell me a little bit about what that is like in your brain. Are you constantly thinking about ways to insert your clients, specifically like Steve, are you, when you're on the campaign trail, is it just constantly like, how can I turn this into news? How can I turn this into news? Yeah.
And, like, I think the thing is, like, when I started my career, I was in sports, and I remember, like, watching Red Sox games, and, like, you would, like, listen for the back cracks and, like, the call from the commentator. Oh, okay, I can use that at work tomorrow. My brain works the same way. Like, that's the way I calibrate. So if I'm, like, sitting at home watching, let's say, the Today Show, like, the first 20 minutes, I'll probably take 6 stories, but I can integrate this client on this and this client on that. And I think that the interesting part, like, to get into the newsjacking of PR, I get, like, alerts on my phone all day. Right now I'm working on a client that's really big in Florida. So, like, if I see the word Florida pop up in any news alert on my phone, I stop what I'm doing, I vet it, I check to see what's going on, and then I run with it. Because I also think, like, that's the thing that people don't talk about either. If a pitch goes out 20 minutes after the news breaks, they've already found their expert. That's why, like, having pre-built lists that are automated, like, and that's why, like, talking about those 75 steps that I was, like, bragging about earlier, like, it is that discernment. There are going to be moments where I just need to get this on television as fast as humanly possible. And, like, that's when, like, if I send an errand pitch to a sports producer and it's a politics story, I apologize. This is my blanket apology to all of you across America. I'm sorry. I'll be better.
It's the breaking news
cycle. Like, there's my little asterisk. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's infinitely interesting. I think is this world where, you do kind of have to be always on. I want to kind of close here with any tips that you might have for people who are in this industry where there is a lot of pressure to be always on. How do you deal with work-life balance, mental health, making sure you're not getting too burnt out? Do you have any tips for people?
I think that, like, a great CEO that I used to work closely with once said, it was the pizza analogy. Like, you can't eat the whole pizza, so you can't completely unplug when you're in PR, because, like, there's always going to be a client fired. There's always going to be an opportunity, so you have to, like, pick those moments to detach, so, like, I may have my phone with me at all times, but I also may, like, stay home an extra hour in the morning, like, to do laundry and catch up on life. So I think that, like, I always joke that, like, I have a bad habit, but it's a good habit of coming to my office late at night. I love to come here from, like, 8 to 11 because I have no life apparently. But also, like, I'll come here from 8 to 11 and, like, I'll, like, have a TV show on. I'll be, like, talking to friends. But if I get 25% of those 3 hours are spent working, like, I'll be so far ahead for the next day that, like, it takes care of itself. So I think the one thing that's kind of cool about having your own company is that, like, if you work hard, like, you have that ability to get ahead. Like, it's in PR too. Like, in news, like, you never had that ability to get ahead. In PR, you do. Like, I can pre-schedule, like, give me some automation. I will write my pitches and schedule them at 11 o'clock at night, and they will go out throughout the day, and no one will be any the different. But that's okay too. So I think that there's a little bit of creativity involved there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Willing to, I like that, kind of put in the time the night before if it's going to give you some free hours the
Absolutely.
next morning, that sort of thing. Yeah. Well, Mike, anything you want to leave listeners with? Anything we didn't cover today that you think is really important that people need to know about it?
I think that at the end of the day, I always say, I call myself the Steph Curry of PR. Take big shots, take big swings. Worst case scenario, they hit delete. Worst case scenario, you wind up in the deleted box. And that is not to be said that you should be sending journalists 75 pitches a day. Let's practice temperance and, discretion. But Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So take the shot. Worst case scenario, you don't I've always said and it always kills me. I always am very gun shy to pitch the New York Times. We all know that's the white whale. I get more responses from the New York Times reporters that still don't cover my story, but they always write back. Maybe not. That's a lie. That is a categorical lie. Once in a very, very blue moon, they write back, and I see their name in my inbox, and my heart drops, and they're like, "Thank you for this. Really appreciate it." I don't know why that day is the one that gets the response, but then I also get to go to my clients, like, the New York Times wrote back. They're not going to put you on the newspaper, but they did write back.
Right back. Hey, small wins. Love it.
Absolutely.
Well, Mike, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you're doing? And you teased out something interesting there. I want people to.
I'm working on a book. We're getting there, but it's the culmination of that election cycle. I need to put it down into paper. It's a work in progress. It's there though. I'm not I want to write a book one day. No. There's an outline. there's chapters. We're getting there. We need to find a publisher, all that stuff. But I think that the experience that I have, especially in the media, is too important to not be able to talk about it. But I'm always on social media. My name, Michael E. Fahey, is my Instagram. I think that the one thing that people don't realize is our personal social media is our personal newsfeed. I am more likely to click through your Instagram than I am to go into any app at this point. People don't realize push alerts, your news feeds, those are really where people need to be capitalizing. The biggest advice that I give to every client, it's not about getting the hits, it's about the amplification. And PR is a symphony of amplification at all times. If you're not playing every instrument, the song doesn't land.
Love it. This has been great. Mike, our listeners, if people have questions for Mike, please leave them in the comments. I can forward them through the mic. I'm sure
Absolutely.
He'd be more than happy
Ask me anything.
to answer them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So look out for Mike's upcoming book. At some point, maybe we'll have you back on the podcast once you get it
Please
going.
Do.
But yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for listening. Reminder, subscribe, share this stuff with your colleagues, and good luck out there.